A little while back, I decided to try and make a first-person animation for a model I made, but I really didn't want to mess with rigging an armature or anything like that. I just wanted to see the gun shoot, aim, reload, that kind of stuff. If that's something you're interested in doing, I might be able to share some insight with you to help you get started with some basic but nice looking animations. For this video, I'll be using this model, but it really doesn't matter whether you've got a better or worse model than this. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your model isn't going to fall apart when it's animated. If you have things like a hammer or trigger that you want to animate separately, don't join them, just parent them like this. That way you can animate them separately, but they'll stick to the gun. You also want to pick a frame rate before you start to animate, by going over to this Output Properties tab. It defaults to 24 FPS, so set it to 60 for a smoother animation. Now that that's all set up, go ahead and position your camera until it looks good. I like to line up the normal viewport and then press Ctrl, Alt, and 0 on the number pad. This places the camera where you're looking in the viewport. Then you can make small adjustments to get it perfect. Now you can start making new keyframes for your animation. First off, let's turn on this little record button. This makes things pretty easy since moving an object will automatically create a keyframe. We'll start by making a keyframe somewhere around 50 frames, since you want the gun to sit still for a moment before firing. To place this first keyframe, select your main weapon object and press the I key and select Location, Rotation, and Scale. Feel free to put this keyframe earlier or later than frame 50. Alright, this is when things start to get fun. Pick a spot a few frames to the right of this first frame. This is going to be a recoil keyframe, so the closer this is to the previous frame, the faster your gun will kick back. You can always adjust it later if the speed isn't right. Now that you have your cursor where you want this keyframe to be, place your model at the peak of its recoil. Don't forget to give it some rotation too. The next keyframe should be a few frames later. This keyframe will keep the gun at this position for a few frames, before it starts to return to the original position. For now, you can just copy and paste the last keyframe. You need to keep your mouse down in this animating tab when copying and pasting, not in the viewport. Otherwise it'll copy and paste whatever you have selected up here. Once you have this keyframe pasted, you should see a line connecting them. This means that no changes happen between these two keyframes, which is good for now. For the final keyframe, pick something like 10 frames from the last one. Copy the first frame and paste it here. This way it returns to the resting state. Now you can press space to watch a preview of your animation. If you want to see through your camera view, press 0 on the number pad. Again, don't be afraid to move these keyframes around to get something that looks good. This animation is pretty basic. Let's add some small details to really make it look interesting. Next, we're going to go over some cool details you can add to your firing animation. The first thing is to add a little bit of tilting to the recoil. Find your first recoil frame and tilt it to the left or right by pressing the R key and then the X key to rotate it around the X axis. You might need to rotate it around a different axis, depending on the orientation of your model. And make sure you have the recording button on so that it saves over the old keyframe. Then go to the next keyframe and rotate it in the opposite direction. This will make the gun rock side to side when it's fired, to make the recoil look a little more natural. You can make the end of the recoil look more natural as well, by making the gun fall too far before returning to the proper resting position. To do this, put your cursor where the end resting keyframe is, and move that keyframe a few frames away. Then, copy that keyframe and paste it here, or you can just copy that keyframe and paste it a few frames away. Then, with your cursor on the earlier frame, rotate the gun downward a bit, and push it down and forward. This way, the gun will fall and tip down before being pulled back to the resting position. This shows the weight of the gun, and represents the user recuperating from the recoil. You'll probably notice that my keyframes move around a lot. I'm not actually keeping them where I originally placed them. All you can really do when placing your first keyframes is guess, and then you can move things around to get the right timing. If you want your weapon to appear very heavy and unwieldy, you can make this drop more slow and drastic. Next up is adding camera shake. This is surprisingly easy and gives the animation more power. First off, let's make a keyframe on the camera. The camera's movement won't be animated until the weapon fires. So the first keyframe for the camera should be the same frame as the first frame of your firing animation, which for me is at frame 50. Again, select your camera and press I, and select Location, Rotation, and Scale. Or you can press G and click while holding your mouse completely still. This logs a keyframe without moving the camera, and without having to find the right option after pressing I. Just don't move your mouse before clicking, or you'll move your object out of position. After making this first keyframe, find the frame that the next keyframe of your firing animation is on. You're basically going to do what you did when you added the tilting to the animation. Add a slight tilt in one direction on this keyframe, and add a slight tilt in the other direction on the next keyframe. Then copy your camera's resting keyframe and paste it a few frames after the second tilt. If you watch your animation, it's starting to look pretty good. If you're running out of room for the animation within the 250 frames, you can change the endpoint right here to give yourself some more room. You should have most of the basic knowledge now to do the animations you want to do. Animating the trigger, hammer, cylinder, bolt, or any other kind of moving part on your gun is just a matter of picking a good frame and placing your keyframe. But there are some animations that might stump you. One of them is aiming. You might try and animate your gun to move from its resting position to a point somewhere in the middle of the screen. If you've played a lot of first-person shooters, you might notice that this doesn't look quite right. That's because you need to keyframe the focal length on the camera to get that zooming effect. Luckily, this is very easy. Go to the first frame of your aiming animation, and then select the camera. Now go over to this camera tab and look for the focal length parameter. It should be defaulted to 50mm. Notice to the right this little dot. If you press this, it allows you to keyframe this parameter in your animation. To insert keyframes, move your cursor into place and press the diamond next to the parameter. Now you can make a keyframe of your resting focal length at the first frame of your aiming animation. Then just animate the focal length to increase up to something like 60 or 70 when the gun is fully aimed, and go back to resting when the aiming stops. If your animation still isn't looking up to par, try enabling motion blur in the Render Properties tab. Assuming you're using the Eevee render engine, it can help to go ahead and turn on ambient occlusion, bloom, and screen space reflections as well. You won't notice motion blur until you render, which I'll show you how to do in a minute. Another thing that you can do is add a kind of muzzle flash to your weapon. Make a point light and position it at the end of the barrel. Then parent it to the rest of your model. Make it a kind of orange color, or whatever you want your muzzle flash to be. Make sure the radius is something like 3. Make a keyframe for the power at 0 as a resting point. Then you can keyframe your power to dramatically increase as soon as the weapon fires, and quickly fade to 0 only a few frames later. You can't really call this a muzzle flash since there won't be a little explosion at the end of the barrel, but it will light up your gun and anything around it when it shoots. And keep in mind, you won't see this light in the preview. You need to render the animation to properly see it. Rendering and exporting an animation in Blender was always a mystical and impossible task for me, but I recently solved it, and it's actually super easy. First, go over to this Output Properties tab. You can see it lets you set your resolution and stuff like that. You probably want your frame endpoint set like 50 or 100 frames after the final frame in your animation. That way it doesn't end too abruptly. Now head on down to this Output section. It'll have a file address here. Set this to where you want your animation to export to. You can click the folder to navigate and select there. You can probably see that the animation is set to export as PNGs, which isn't right. Select this option and click on FFmpeg video. Then click this little encoding dropdown and switch it from Matroska, whatever that means, to MPEG-4. Before you start rendering, make sure your project is saved, in case it decides to crash while rendering. Now that you've saved, start rendering by pressing Ctrl and F12, or pressing Render in the top left, and then Render Animation. Come back in 5 minutes or hours, depending on your computer, and you should find the MP4 file in your folder that you set it to export to. Hopefully you learned enough watching this. If you've got questions, feel free to ask them in the comments section. I'll respond the best I can to each of them. Thanks. Take care.